August 9th, 1945. The heat in Tokyo was oppressive, the kind of humid thickness that made breathing feel like work. In the underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, the air was cooler, but no less suffocating. General Korechika Anami, Minister of War, sat at a heavy wooden table surrounded by maps that no longer offered any strategic comfort. His uniform was immaculate despite the circumstances, his bearing erect despite the exhaustion that pulled at his bones. The maps told a story of collapse. Red marks indicated enemy positions, and there were far too many of them. Okinawa lost, the Philippines lost, Burma lost. The entire Pacific perimeter that Japan had conquered with such stunning speed in 1941 and 1942 was gone, rolled back island by bloody island. American forces were now within striking distance of the home islands. The naval blockade had tightened to a noose. Cities were being incinerated by bombing raids that faced virtually no opposition. But it was the message that had arrived 2 hours earlier that had drained the color from even the most fanatical faces in the room. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with overwhelming force. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, stood by the wall map, his finger tracing the Soviet advance. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, the force that had conquered Manchuria and held it for 14 years, was being shredded. The Soviets had attacked with more than 1 million men, thousands of tanks, overwhelming air support. The Kwantung Army had been bled of its best units over the years, transferred to defend the Pacific Islands and the home islands. What remained was a hollow shell equipped with outdated weapons, short on supplies, facing one of the most powerful military machines on Earth. Anami remembered when the Kwantung Army had been Japan's greatest strength. In the 1930s, it had been the vehicle of Japanese expansion, the force that had carved out the puppet state of Manchukuo, that had pushed into China proper, that had clashed with Soviet forces at Nomonhan. Now it was being swept aside like rice paper before a typhoon. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the Navy minister, sat with his hands folded on the table. His face was grave, worn by the knowledge of what the Imperial Navy had become. Once the third most powerful navy in the world, it was now a fleet of ghosts. The carriers were gone, sunk at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. The battleships were gone, destroyed at Leyte Gulf, or huddled in ports with no fuel to sortie. The submarine force had never been properly utilized, had never interdicted American supply lines the way the Americans had strangled Japan's. The room fell silent as another officer entered with a dispatch. General Anami took it and read quickly, his jaw tightened. Hiroshima. The reports were fragmentary, contradictory, impossible to believe. A single bomb had destroyed the entire city. Not a raid, not 1,000 aircraft dropping incendiaries. One bomb, one aircraft, one city gone. The Americans were calling it an atomic bomb. Japanese scientists had told the military leadership that such a weapon was theoretically possible, but would require industrial resources beyond what Japan possessed. They never seriously believed the Americans could build one either. The idea was too monstrous, too far beyond conventional warfare. But the reports kept coming. Reconnaissance flights over Hiroshima showed a city that had simply ceased to exist. The blast radius was measured in kilometers. The death toll was estimated in the tens of thousands, perhaps more. Communications with the city had been severed completely. Survivors stumbling out of the ruins told stories that sounded like supernatural horror. A flash brighter than the sun, a shock wave that leveled buildings like children's blocks, a heat that incinerated people where they stood, leaving only shadows burned into stone. General Umezu turned from the map. His voice was steady, but something in his eyes had changed. We must consider our position realistically. The Soviet entry into the war eliminates our last diplomatic option. We had hoped to use Moscow as an intermediary for negotiating a conditional surrender. That option no longer exists. The word surrender hung in the air like poisoned gas. It was a word that no Japanese general was supposed to utter. The Imperial Army did not surrender. The code of Bushido demanded death before dishonor. Soldiers were expected to fight to the last man, to commit suicide rather than be captured. The entire edifice of Japanese military culture was built on the principle that surrender was unthinkable. But Anami knew that Umezu was right. The strategic situation was not merely bad, it was hopeless. The question was whether anyone in this room was willing to acknowledge that reality openly. He thought back to December 1941, to the heady days after Pearl Harbor. The Americans had been caught completely by surprise. Their Pacific Fleet had been crippled. In the months that followed, Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch Indies, the Philippines, Burma, all had fallen. The British had been humiliated, the Dutch defeated. The Americans pushed back to a defensive perimeter. The Greater East Asia cooperative sphere had seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Where had it gone wrong? Midway. That was the simple answer, the turning point that every officer could point to. June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had attempted to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them. Instead, through a combination of American code-breaking and tactical fortune, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. The cream of the carrier pilots, irreplaceable veterans, had gone down with their ships or been lost when they had nowhere to land. But the rot had started earlier in the decision-making that led to war in the first place. Anami had been part of those discussions, had supported the Southern strategy, the attack on American, British, and Dutch possessions. The embargo. Japan had been strangled by the American oil embargo, had faced a choice between abandoning China and going to war. The military had chosen war. The assumption had been that America, soft and democratic and divided, would not have the stomach for a long fight. Japan would establish a defensive perimeter, fortify it, make the cost of reconquest too high for American public opinion to bear. A negotiated peace would follow, leaving Japan in control of its conquests. Every assumption had been wrong. America had proven far from soft. The industrial mobilization had been staggering. The willingness to take casualties had exceeded Japanese expectations. The island-hopping campaign had bypassed strongpoints and struck at weak links. The submarine campaign had devastated Japanese shipping, cutting the home islands off from the resources of the conquered territories. By 1945, Japan was starving, its industry grinding to a halt for lack of raw materials. And now this, the atomic bomb, the Soviet invasion. The world had indeed turned against Japan, but it was more than that. The world had developed weapons and strategies that rendered Japanese courage and sacrifice meaningless. What good was the willingness to die for the emperor when a single bomb could vaporize an entire city? What good were fortifications when they could be bypassed or obliterated? Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi entered the bunker. He was the father of the kamikaze strategy, the man who had organized the suicide attacks that had terrified American sailors in the final year of the war. His face was haggard. The kamikazes had killed thousands of Americans, had sunk dozens of ships, but they had not changed the strategic situation. They had been a weapon of desperation, and desperation was not a strategy. The Americans are preparing for invasion, Onishi said. Our intelligence suggests 2 operations, Kyushu in November, then the Kanto Plain in the spring. They expect to lose hundreds of thousands of men. They are preparing for total war against the home islands. General Anami nodded slowly. The Japanese military had been preparing for this scenario for months. The entire population was to be mobilized. Men, women, children, all would fight. Bamboo spears if necessary. The beaches would be fortified. The mountains would become strongholds. Every city would be defended house by house. The American casualties would be catastrophic, but so would the Japanese casualties. The entire nation would be destroyed, not defeated, destroyed. Tens of millions dead. The Japanese race itself threatened with extinction. And now there was the atomic bomb to consider. If the Americans could drop one on Hiroshima, they could drop more. Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Nagoya, every city in Japan could be obliterated from the air without a single American soldier setting foot on Japanese soil. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki had been pushing for surrender through back channels, seeking terms that would preserve the emperor and some measure of Japanese sovereignty. The military hardliners had resisted, arguing for continued resistance, for the decisive battle that would inflict such casualties on the Americans that they would accept a negotiated peace. That hope was gone now. The Soviet invasion made clear that Japan faced not just America, but the entire world. The British, the Chinese, the Soviets, the Americans, all united against Japan. There would be no negotiated peace. There would be unconditional surrender or annihilation. Anami stood and walked to the map. He placed his hand on Manchuria, the territory Japan had held for 14 years, the industrial heartland that was supposed to sustain the war effort. The Soviets were sweeping through it. The Kwantung Army was being routed. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in Manchuria were fleeing south, trying to reach the coast before the Soviet forces caught them. He thought about the soldiers under his command. How many had already died? Millions, certainly. The exact count was impossible to know. So many had been left behind on islands ordered to fight to the death, cut off from supply or reinforcement. Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each island had become a mass grave. The submarine losses alone were staggering. The Imperial Navy had lost more than 130 submarines. The Americans had hunted them with terrifying efficiency. Japanese merchant shipping had been devastated, more than 8 million tons sunk. The oil from the Dutch East Indies could not reach Japan. The rubber, the tin, the rice from Southeast Asia could not get through. The co-prosperity sphere had become a hollow shell, each conquered territory isolated and vulnerable. General Umezu began speaking, his voice carefully controlled. We must brief the Emperor on the situation. His Majesty must understand that our strategic position has fundamentally changed. The Soviet entry into the war was our worst-case scenario. We had calculated that with the Soviets neutral, we could concentrate our forces against an American invasion. We could inflict sufficient casualties to achieve favorable terms. And now? Anami asked, though he clearly knew the answer. Now we face a two-front war with no strategic reserves, no industrial capacity to sustain prolonged resistance, and an enemy that possesses weapons we cannot counter. Umezu paused. Gentlemen, we must consider that continued resistance may result in the complete extermination of the Japanese people. The words fell like stones into deep water. This was the thought that no one had been willing to speak aloud until now. The military culture of Japan, the code that demanded death before dishonor, the belief in the divine mission of the Japanese state, all of it crashed against the reality of atomic weapons and worldwide opposition. Anami felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He was a samurai by tradition, a warrior by training and inclination. Everything in his education, his career, his identity revolted against the idea of surrender.
But he was also responsible for the lives of millions of soldiers, and beyond that, for the survival of the Japanese nation itself. He remembered the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, when Japan had stunned the world by defeating a European power. It had been the foundation of Japanese expansion, the proof that modernization and military prowess could make Japan the equal of the Western powers. The victory at Tsushima had been total, the Russian Baltic Fleet annihilated. But that victory was 40 years ago, to a Russia that was already weak, already approaching revolution. The Soviet Union of 1945 was a different beast entirely, hardened by the war against Germany, equipped with enormous reserves of men and material, battle-tested and ruthless. And America. America had revealed itself to be something unprecedented in history, an industrial colossus capable of fighting on two fronts simultaneously, of outproducing the rest of the world combined, of developing weapons that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than reality. Japan had based its strategy on assumptions about American weakness that had proven catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not sued for peace after their early defeats. They had not balked at casualties. They had not allowed Japan time to consolidate its conquests. Instead, they had mobilized on a scale that Japan could not match, had developed tactics and weapons that nullified Japanese advantages, had prosecuted the war with methodical, grinding efficiency. The door opened again. Emperor Hirohito's chamberlain entered and bowed deeply. His Majesty has called an imperial conference for tonight. All senior military and civilian leaders are to attend. His Majesty wishes to hear the views of his advisors on the current situation. After the chamberlain left, the room remained silent. An imperial conference where the emperor would actively solicit opinions was extraordinary. Normally, such conferences were formalities, rubber-stamping decisions already made by the military and civilian leadership. For the emperor to personally intervene meant that he understood the gravity of the situation, that he was prepared to exercise his authority in ways that are usually left implicit. General Anami knew what this meant. The emperor was preparing to end the war. The question was whether the military would accept such a decision or whether hardliners would attempt a coup to prevent surrender. He looked around the room at the other officers. Vice Admiral Onishi, the kamikaze advocate, looked like a man watching his world collapse. General Umezu seemed resigned, his military professionalism overriding his emotional resistance to surrender. Vice Admiral Yonai had been among the more moderate voices from the beginning, had never fully believed that war with America was winnable. The younger officers, the colonels and majors who served as aides and staff, had different expressions. Some showed shock, others fury, others a kind of numb acceptance. These were men who had been raised in the militaristic culture of the 1930s, who had known nothing but expansion and conquest. The idea that Japan could be defeated was almost incomprehensible to them. But defeat was the reality. The maps showed it. The casualty reports confirmed it. The loss of Hiroshima demonstrated it. The Soviet invasion sealed it. Anami thought about his own family. His wife and children were in Tokyo, living in a city that was systematically destroyed by American firebombing. The raid in March had killed more than 100,000 people in a single night, had created a firestorm that consumed 16 miles of the city, and that's with conventional weapons. If the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Tokyo, his family would be vaporized instantly. Multiply that calculation by millions. Every general in this room had family in Japan, had friends, had ancestral homes, had a stake in the physical survival of the nation. The abstract honor of Bushido had to be weighed against the concrete reality of genocide. There will be officers who refuse to accept surrender, General Umezu said quietly. We must prepare for that possibility. The army will not submit to such a decision, even if it comes from the emperor himself.
This was the other reality they faced. The Japanese military had become, in many ways, a state within a state. It had operated independently of civilian government, had made foreign policy through direct action, had assassinated political opponents in the 1930s. The military culture emphasized loyalty to the institution and to abstract concepts of honor over loyalty to specific individuals or even to the emperor's direct commands. If hardliners in the military decided that surrender was unacceptable, they might attempt to overthrow the government, might seize the emperor and govern in his name, might continue the war regardless of his wishes. It had happened before in the 1930s, when young officers had launched attempted coups in the name of the emperor against governments they deemed insufficiently committed to military expansion. Anami knew he would play a crucial role in preventing such a scenario. As war minister, his support for surrender would carry enormous weight. If he opposed it, the army might follow him into rebellion. If he supported it, most of the army would follow his lead. The question was what he could live with. Could he live with ordering the Japanese military to lay down its arms? Could he live with the knowledge that millions had died for a cause that would end in unconditional surrender? Could he live with the stain of being the war minister who presided over Japan's greatest defeat? Or could he live with the alternative, presiding over the complete annihilation of the Japanese nation, the extinction of Japanese culture, the deaths of tens of millions in a futile resistance against overwhelming force and apocalyptic weapons? Another dispatch arrived. A second atomic bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki. Another city obliterated, another 100,000 dead or dying. The Americans had more than one bomb. They could do this again and again until there was nothing left. Admiral Yonai spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "Gentlemen, we must face the truth. We have lost. Not lost a battle, not lost a campaign, but lost the war completely and irrevocably. The question now is not whether to surrender, but how to surrender in a way that preserves something of Japan for the future." "The emperor," Anami said quietly. "We must preserve the emperor. Whatever else we sacrifice, the imperial institution must continue. It is the soul of Japan, the link between past and future." The others nodded. This was the one non-negotiable point. The Americans were demanding unconditional surrender, but if that meant the emperor would be tried as a war criminal or forced to abdicate, many in the military would rather fight to extinction. The emperor was not just a political leader, but a divine figure, the descendant of the sun goddess, the embodiment of Japanese identity and continuity. If the emperor personally commanded surrender, and if his position was guaranteed, then resistance could be overcome. Officers might disobey the government, might defy the war ministry, but few would directly disobey a personal command from the emperor himself. The chamberlain returned. His Majesty will see the senior military leaders now before the full imperial conference. He wishes to understand the military situation in detail. They filed out of the bunker and made their way through the underground corridors to the palace shelter. The palace above them was in ruins from the bombing raids, but the imperial family had been moved to secure underground quarters. Emperor Hirohito was a slight man, scholarly in demeanor, 44 years old, but looking older from the strain of the war years. He wore a military uniform, but carried himself with none of the martial swagger of the generals. He had been a reluctant participant in the expansion of the 1930s and early 1940s, had ultimately approved the decision for war, but had never been its driving force. The generals bowed deeply. The emperor gestured for them to sit. "I have been reading the reports, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. I must know the truth of our situation. Can we continue to resist?
What would be the cost of such resistance? General Umezu responded, his voice formal and precise. Your Majesty, the military situation is grave. The Soviet invasion has destroyed our last diplomatic option and threatens to overwhelm our forces in Manchuria and Korea. The American blockade has reduced our industrial capacity to a fraction of what is required. The atomic bomb represents a weapon against which we have no defense.
The casualties of continued resistance, the Emperor asked. There was a long pause. Finally, Anami spoke. Your Majesty, if we fight to the end as currently planned, casualties would be measured in the tens of millions. The entire population would be mobilized. Every city could potentially face destruction from atomic weapons. The Japanese race itself would be threatened with extinction. The Emperor's face remained impassive, but his hands tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. And if we surrender? The terms would likely be harsh, Admiral Yonai said. Occupation, war crimes trials, loss of all conquered territories, possibly loss of territory from the home islands. The Americans demand unconditional surrender. But the nation would survive, the Emperor said. It was not quite a question. Yes, Your Majesty, Anami said. The nation would survive. The people would survive. In time, Japan could rebuild. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, looking at each of the generals in turn. When he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that none of them had heard before. I have concluded that continuation of the war can only result in the annihilation of the Japanese people and a prolongation of suffering throughout the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. We will accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender, provided the imperial institution is preserved. The words hung in the air. The Emperor had spoken. The divine voice had issued its command. The war would end. General Anami felt tears forming in his eyes, though he would not allow them to fall. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, everything that had given his life meaning for decades, all of it was ending. But the Emperor had commanded, and he would obey. The others bowed deeply, acknowledging the Emperor's decision. There would be details to work out, communications to send, resistance to overcome. But the fundamental decision had been made by the one person whose authority was absolute. They left the Emperor's presence in silence, each man carrying the weight of what had just occurred. As they walked back through the underground corridors, Anami's mind was already working through the implications. The Imperial Conference would formalize the decision, but the real challenge would come afterward, convincing the military to actually lay down its arms. Back in the bunker, the atmosphere had changed. Word had somehow leaked that the Emperor favored surrender. The younger officers looked stricken, some openly angry. Anami could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. Would they obey? Would they rebel? Would there be a coup attempt? He gathered the senior staff around him. The Emperor has spoken his will. We will comply with his decision. Anyone who fails to do so will be acting in violation of the Emperor's direct command. Is that understood? The officers bowed, but Anami could see the resistance in some faces. Vice Admiral Onishi, in particular, looked as though he had been struck. This was a man who had sent thousands of young pilots to their deaths in suicide attacks, who had believed utterly in the righteousness of the cause. To be told now that it had all been for nothing was more than he could bear. The Imperial Conference convened at midnight.
The underground conference room was stifling despite the ventilation systems. The cabinet minister sat on one side of the table, the military leaders on the other. Emperor Hirohito sat at the head, an unprecedented arrangement. Normally, he would have observed silently while his advisors debated. Prime Minister Suzuki opened the proceedings, outlining the dire situation. He then called for opinions on whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration demanding unconditional surrender. The debate that followed was agonizing. The military hardliners favored continued resistance. General Anami found himself in a peculiar position. Personally, he agreed with much of what they said about honor and the warrior code, but he had heard the emperor's will and he understood the practical realities. War Minister Anami spoke carefully, trying to thread an impossible needle. The military situation is indeed grave, but we must consider what terms we can accept. If we can preserve the emperor and the imperial institution, if we can avoid military occupation, if we can conduct our own disarmament, then perhaps surrender becomes possible. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo shook his head. The Americans will not negotiate these terms. The Potsdam Declaration is clear: unconditional surrender. They will occupy Japan. They will disarm us. The only question they might concede is the emperor's status, and even that is not guaranteed. The debate continued for hours, going in circles. The civilian ministers generally favored acceptance. The military leaders were divided, with some supporting continued resistance despite the odds. The deadlock was complete. Finally, at 2 a.m, Prime Minister Suzuki did something unprecedented. He turned to the emperor and asked him to break the tie, to make the decision himself. The room fell absolutely silent. Emperor Hirohito stood, his slight figure seeming to carry immense weight. When he spoke, his voice was steady but emotional. It has been mentioned that there are many causes for anxiety concerning the survival of the nation. However, I have decided to endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable.